All right. Hello and welcome to everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amir Badat. I am the Southern States Director and Senior Advisor at Fair Fight. I am based here in Jackson, Mississippi, and I focus on Fair Fight's work throughout the South. And I'm incredibly excited to be here with everyone here tonight. Fair Fight Action is a nationally recognized leader and Georgia-based nonprofit that fights for free and fair elections. We fight against voter suppression, we expose anti-voter policies, work to protect and expand voting rights, engage individual voters at a grassroots level, support pro-voter candidates, and convene civic engagement organizations to ensure elections are free and fair because every vote and voice matters. Tonight, we are thrilled to have you here with us as we introduce our new speaker series, Fair Fight Together. We recognize that for many of us, this moment is fraught with tension and concern. In the face of the challenges ahead of us, Fair Fight remains unwavering in its mission. And this speaker series is one of our efforts to bring our community together to support, educate, and motivate each other. Tonight's event is the launch of a regular series where we will gather with our friends, supporters, activists, and advocates, all those people who support an America by and for we the people. We all have more power and agency than we may feel like we do, and together we will find the path forward. Tonight's kickoff will feature two of our democracy's most fierce champions, Stacey Abrams and Joyce Vance. We are incredibly excited to have you as part of this important and powerful conversation that will focus on where we currently stand as a democratic society and our role as citizens in honoring, protecting, and advancing it. Now, for a few housekeeping items, we welcome your questions. We received more than 800 questions ahead of tonight, which is amazing. I love to see the engagement and interest in tonight's event. Many of those questions we will be posing to our speakers. If you have additional questions during the conversation, please put them in the chat, and we will try our very best to address as many questions as we can. If you are distracted by the chat, by all of the questions, you can manually turn it off on your screen. You can also use closed captioning by turning it on at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we will be sending out a recap of the Zoom, which will include the recording and all of the links. And with all of that, I am delighted to introduce our distinguished guest tonight. Stacey Abrams is a New York Times bestselling author, business owner, and political leader whose innovative approach has continued to break barriers and support transformational progress. She served as minority leader in the Georgia House of Representatives, and she was the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in U.S. history. Abrams has launched multiple nonprofit organizations devoted to democracy protection, including Fair Fight, thank you, Stacey, and Fair Count. She has also founded SageWorks Productions, Inc., a media company dedicated to leveraging the power of storytelling to craft creative solutions. She currently serves as Howard University's Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair for Race and Black Politics and resides in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Stacey. Thank you for being here. Our other guest tonight is Joyce Vance. Joyce is a lawyer who served as the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama from 2009 to 2017. She was the first woman U.S. Attorney nominated by President Barack Obama. She is a distinguished professor of the practice of law at the University of Alabama School of Law, and she is also a legal analyst for NBC and MSNBC. She co-hosts the Sisters-in-Law and the Cafe Insider podcasts, and she writes a newsletter, Civil Discourse. She also sits on the Bipartisan Advisory Board of States United Democracy Center and is a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law. Stacey and Joyce, thank you again so much for being here tonight. Let's get this conversation started.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. I have to say to everybody, if you thought that you could never love Stacey Abrams any more than you already love her, when she lifted up that mug and it said "Live long and prosper" on it, man, love that.
There we go. So I have an opening question for you guys. we are in a unique political environment. There is a tremendous amount of concern about the current political situation we face. People are worried about the erosion of our democratic institutions, our basic rights are being taken away, and there's an intense desire for guidance on how to effectively respond. And what I have told people, what I think is interesting is that a lot of these challenges that we're now facing as a country as a whole, the South has experienced for a long time. And so for you two, as two prominent women who have been doing this work in the South for a long time, what lessons have you learned from that work that could be useful for us as a country? And how important is the South in the fight to protect our democracy and our rights? Well, let's start off with you, Stacey.
Thank you. Thank you, Honor. And it's always an honor to be anywhere Joyce Vance is. So I begin this conversation by pointing out that the reason I've anchored my work in the South is that I fundamentally believe that what we can solve in the South works for everyone, because we are the seat of so many of the pathologies and challenges and ignominies that have been made manifest in our country, but we're also the architects of some of the most creative, thoughtful, and resilient solutions. And so because I grew up in Mississippi, came of age in Georgia, went to grad school in Texas, I've spent my life thinking about how do we leverage both the challenges and the opportunities of the South. And I think there are the two most salient pieces that I would point out. First and foremost is state capture. What we're watching happen at the federal level, we have watched happen in the South for the last, I guess, since our inception. And that is when private interests are used to make public decisions. We're watching Elon Musk get the credit for it, but he's not alone. He is accompanied by an entire phalanx of those who have been waiting for someone who was reckless enough to risk the United States in this moment to give them access to more power. And what we've done in the South is we've worked around it. We have found ways to push back. We have used amplification, talking about the issues, but we've also organized ourselves, recognizing that no one was coming to save us. Often when you hear about boycotts, what people leave out of the conversation is that often boycotts mean that the people that you need to help you aren't coming. And so there is a self-sufficiency that the South has cultivated that I think is very important in this moment. And that brings me to my second point. That is that each of us has the ability to have an impact. That while we keep waiting for our leaders to tell us what to do, what we've learned in the South is we've got to lead ourselves. We've got to organize ourselves. We've got to communicate with one another. And we have to use our own agency to build the kind of leadership that our leaders will then use. I celebrate and support those who are on the right side of history, but sometimes we have to show them what the right side of history needs to look like. So they're already here with us, but we can't necessarily wait for a top-down solution. Part of our job is to build it from the bottom up and invite anyone who wants to be a part of it to come and join us, because the South is very welcoming. We're very hospitable.
Southern hospitality is the one of the characteristics that I brag about all the time and try to convince people to move to Mississippi to experience. And so, Joyce, tell us from your perspective, having been the U.S. Attorney in Alabama, having taught law and practiced law in Alabama for so many years, what are some of the lessons that you've learned, and what can the entire country learn from the South in this moment?
Yeah, so I think Stacey does a great job of giving you a sense of the landscape. And I would just focus on a couple of points. One is a phenomenon that I call the Alabamization of America. I feel like everything that's happened in our country from 2016 when Trump was elected on is stuff that we in the Deep South experienced 5, 6, 10 years in advance. In other words, none of it was surprising, not the meanness, not the ferocity, not the success, because I'm actually old enough to remember when Alabama was a Democratic state. When I moved here, every person holding statewide office was a Democrat. My father-in-law, who went on to become a federal judge, was the chair of the Alabama State Democratic Party and had forged an alliance with Black Democrats who had been completely excluded from the political process. I mean, lots of historical indignity, voter suppression, but just also this rank refusal to include people in a process and to completely shut them out. And something that I take away from the stories that I used to hear around the dinner table, not all of them the kinds of stories that you can repeat in public, because this was a raucous, fun-loving group who believed that you had to break a few eggs to get something done in politics and to beat back the likes of George Wallace, who they were opposed to. But I think that the takeaway that I had was that you can beat back the George Wallaces. You can beat back the folks in your own party who have views that are unsavory and that you don't agree with, while at the same time forging alliances that permit you to get important work done. Because that's the real problem of Donald Trump, right? It's the fact that we are all so busy and so focused on fighting to hold on to democracy, for God's sake, that the real world this country needs can't happen. The criminal justice reform, the voting reform, the just merely reforming transportation, you name it, we're not getting to it because we're fighting for our lives. We saw that in Alabama earlier. We saw the meanness towards immigration, which, quite frankly, when it was adopted in Alabama by statute, harmed our economy. That's what we're going to see on the national level. Donald Trump is going to strip the vitality out of our economy if he proceeds on this course. Same thing with voter suppression. It became desperately hard to vote in Alabama for many people. We're, of course, the state where Shelby County versus Holder happened, gutting the Voting Rights Act. And Alabama, as the legacy of that case, was able to pass a very tough voter ID act. So tough that when my mom moved here in her 70s, she could not vote until I tracked down the ability to get her birth certificate certified from St. Louis, which was really tough. They had redrawn county lines or something. It took me like 4 months to sort it out. And I thought, this is really tough for me. I'm a United States attorney. This is very difficult. How difficult is this for regular folks who just want to exercise their right to vote, but who don't happen to have a passport handy? That was Alabama and what Alabama did. Stacey is dead on the money when she says that our path forward is to mobilize and become partners around that. And then I think the last thing that I'll say is just this: we really are the cavalry, right? There's nobody else coming. It is up to us to figure this out in ways big and small. So stay really well armed and alert to what's going on nationally, but think about how you can solve the problems that exist locally.
Thanks so much, Joyce. I'm glad that you mentioned voting rights and the Shelby County case. This is an event that is being attended by the Fair Fight family, and so everyone, of course, has voting rights very close to their hearts. And so I want to switch over to talking a little bit more about kind of the voting rights landscape that we're facing with this new administration. And this is a question for both of you. What do you think is the biggest threat to voting rights right now as we enter the first few months of this new administration? And what are the guardrails that are left to prevent further erosion of our voting rights? Let's start with you, Joyce.
Well, mostly I worry in this area. I mean, I'm just going to be candid. I'm not going to pretend that this is any less of a problem than it is. I think we've already seen a commitment from these folks to steal an election if they lose it. So far, that's only been at the top of the ballot. Who knows what we'll face going forward? Among the issues that worry me the most is the resurgence of this unitary executive theory that would permit in the states, legislatures, particularly ones that are very strongly dominated by Republicans, to reverse the outcome of the elections. The theory would say that it's not up to the courts, which is where elections are usually decided, but rather that these partisan legislatures would be able to, in essence, throw the vote. Stacey, of course, is familiar with this notion of having a presidential candidate call your Secretary of State to ask him to find a few thousand votes that he needs to win. We could literally be in that position with state legislatures. I think that tops the list of horribles for me.
And Stacey, I'll throw the question over to you. What concerns you the most, and what do you think are some of the guardrails that we still have in place today?
So we're watching one of those guardrails hopefully continue to hold in North Carolina. The 3-month saga of seating a Supreme Court justice in North Carolina because her opponent who lost is trying to throw out 60,000 votes. Right now, the courts continue to side with democracy and not with their political ends, which is not always the case in North Carolina. And we're going to watch in Wisconsin in April. There's another Supreme Court seat that's going to be up for grabs. And you're going to see remarkable amounts of investment coming from outside actors. And so for folks who are wondering, what should I be paying attention to? Pay attention to what's happening in Wisconsin. To Joyce's point about unitary government, part of the way unitary government comes into power is by weakening the ability of the courts to have a say. And it is much easier when the courts abdicate responsibility. So we should be watching, investing in, championing, talking about the Wisconsin case, Wisconsin election. I'm going to be talking about it a lot over the next few months because I was born there too. But it is a space where if they can do this, if they can seize the Supreme Courts, which is what they've done at the federal level and what they've tried to do before at the state level, that then weakens the ability of the courts to intercede. And then you're left with, as Joyce aptly pointed out, a state legislature, every member of which thinks that one day they could be the governor, and then governors who all think they can be president or something else. And so you've got political power that is trying to seize the easiest route to that power. And the only thing in their way are voters. The second part of what I would say is that, and you've heard me say this before if you've listened to me talk about this, there are 3 facets of voter suppression. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? And so we cannot just look for the big set pieces, the dramatic moments. We've got to look at the small things that they're trying to do. So for example, the SAVE Act, which is in front of Congress right now, as it is currently written, it would not permit women who do not have their maiden name, who adopt their husband's names, it would not allow them to use that documentation. And so, and this may be poor draftsmanship, it may be conspiracy theory, but it is a current problem that needs to be solved. And so it's not just looking for the big things they do. It's why in Georgia, they are trying to eliminate access to absentee balloting, something that Republicans created. It is why they are in, I'm trying to remember which state I was reading about today, where they're trying to eliminate voter registration drives because too many people were signing up. And so around the country, we can't just look for the hoses and the dogs. We've got to look at the fine print because we are in a moment where they don't need to get rid of everyone. They need to get rid of some of us. They need to close ranks around the margins and shove us into the abyss. And so as we think about the guardrails, it comes, and we're going to say this over and over again, it's the folks on this call. We are the guardrails because we can pay attention. We can show up, not just at the state legislative meetings when they're trying to change the rules, but we should be talking to our city council members and our county commissioners and our school. Any person who is elected should be outraged at anyone trying to rig an election and change the nature of how our elections work. So don't just focus on the people who've announced their bad action, focus on those who will be affected by those bad actions and demand that they speak up for every one of us who has the right to participate in elections.
Yeah, modern day voter suppression, to your point, Stacey, the way that I think about it a lot of times is that it's really death by a thousand cuts. We have so many of these small examples, what we consider small examples, but for the individual person, obviously, is really profound deprivation of their voting rights. And it happens all over the country. And together, when taken together, it amounts to something really significant. Stacey, you mentioned the SAVE Act. And Joyce, I know that this is something that you have written about recently. And so for our audience, can you tell us a little bit more about what the SAVE Act does and what are some of the means that we might have to oppose some of the negative impacts of the SAVE Act?
So I'm going to defer to Joyce on the content and then I'll talk about the rabble rousing.
I always like listening to you talk about the rabble rousing. Look, y'all, the SAVE Act, this isn't the first time that it's been circulating in Congress, but this time they seem to be serious about it. I'm going to mess up the number. It's either HB 42 or 44. Stacey, do you know? I want to say it's 42.
Yeah.
It's this is the Republicans in the House have suggested that this is one of their top priorities for passage. Stacey says she's not sure if some of the bad stuff in it is just a drafting error or not, and I tend to agree with her on that. I think some of what's in this act is a drafting error, and what frightens me is that they've embraced the bad stuff. And instead of seeing a willingness to correct things that in a normal Congress would be fixed, we're just saying them say, yeah, this is really great. The core of the SAVE Act is the requirement that you have to be able to prove your citizenship in order to be able to register to vote. So Stacey talks about the points at which voter suppression occurs, registration, voting, having your vote counted. This is the registration step. This would prevent you from registering unless you could prove your citizenship. And as you may know, there aren't very many documents that can do that. Passport, birth certificate, maybe a couple of other specified items. If you don't happen to have yours sitting around, by the way, your parents may have your birth certificate in a lockbox, but if you're a college student on the other end of the country, that doesn't do you much good. And if you're an older person who doesn't need and can't afford a passport, it's $130 just to fill out the application. That's just for starters. You may not be able to vote. I think, though, this bill, and this is where the drafting really gets interesting, I think it has the ability to do away with what we think of as automatic registration, even online registration, which, by the way, is provided by for federal law on the Motor Voter Act, makes it a requirement that all states permit you to register online. Not all states are in compliance. The SAVE Act says you got to hand over that ID in person. So we are talking about a severe restriction on the ability to register. I think, frankly, this is an all hands on deck event. People need to start talking to their elected officials now about it. If you've got members of the House who are Republicans, express your concern. If you are a woman, if you are a married woman, this may well make it nigh impossible for you to register. This is, I think, helpful in this one sense. Here's the silver lining. This bill is going to hurt everyone so badly that a lot of people, and we've all seen this tendency, right? People who are sitting this one out, they're saying, well, Trump is bad, but it's not affecting me, so I'm just going to keep your head down. Well, it's going to affect you. And if it doesn't affect you, it's going to affect your wife, your daughter, your mother, your friend, your neighbor. Everyone has some skin in the game on this one. The time for us to start working against it is now.
And what I would add is, again, do not just think about the elected officials who get to cast a vote. Think about the elected officials who need a vote. I know there are a lot of folks who live in red areas, red cities, red counties, red states. Everybody who's been put into office had to get there somehow. And so often we are myopic in how we think about it. This person votes on this bill, therefore that's who I'm going to talk to. And he is not for my party, so he's not going to listen. It doesn't matter. Every person who gets elected now works for you if you are in their state, in their district, in their community. So do not select out of participation. Recognize that your power is as broad as you want it to be. Because if that county commissioner got elected, then they need to know that it's going to be harder next time. If that city council member, if that school board member, all of those people are fair game for this conversation. And one of the ways we can show up that they're not expecting is we need to show up at school board meetings and talk about the SAVE Act. We need to be at zoning committee meetings and talking about the SAVE Act. We often segregate ourselves to the places where we think power is waiting to see us. We need to show up where power doesn't know we know they are. That's my approach. And so in this moment with the SAVE Act, it is a salient opportunity to hold people accountable who have said that it's not their job. It is their job. If they are representatives of some form of some of us in the form of government that we like to call democracy, then it is their job to protect that democracy, and we cannot let them off the hook.
I think that that's such an important point, and it also makes me think of one of the other provisions of the SAVE Act that imposes civil and criminal penalties on election officials for just making a mistake and potentially registering someone without having the necessary documentation that the SAVE Act requires, which I think if you presented that to election officials who are elected officials oftentimes in these spaces, they probably wouldn't be that happy about that. And so I think to your point, Stacey, it's really important to talk to all of our elected officials about these types of issues. Shifting gears.
Before,
Sorry, go ahead.
just
Go
because
ahead.
it popped up in the previews, someone said the SAVE Act is federal. Here's the thing to remember. Bad doesn't stop at the top. If they can pass it as federal law, most local governments just adopt what the federal law allows them to constrain. So we can't tell ourselves, well, it's just federal, it's not state. And I know that's not what you were saying, but I think it's an important point for folks to understand. It may start there, it won't stop there. So we've got to make sure it ends there.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about the attacks that we're seeing on DEI. We're seeing an all-out assault on what folks are calling DEI. We know that these attacks are really an assault on the ability of marginalized communities to prosper in our society. And so I think that we'd love to hear from you about how you think about these attacks. How far do you think the administration will or can go in undoing the efforts to remedy historical discrimination? And what are some of our avenues to challenge these attacks?
I'm
Stacey,
glad
I'll start
you,
with you.
I'm glad you asked. So I've spent the last year and a half really focused on DEI, and I'm going to do this pretty quickly. But we've got to stop thinking about DEI as an HR issue. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and we need to use both. There's this argument, oh, just call it by its full name. It doesn't matter if you use the full name if nobody knows that's what you're talking about, if they're only hearing about DEI. But here's the thing. There are three pathways to success in the United States. Education, what you know, the economy, what you do, and elections, who's in charge. They have been assiduously and systematically attacking all of the laws that have been put in place since the American Revolution to make it possible for every American to participate fully in those three roadways to success. They started with Shelby v. Holder, as Joyce pointed out. The Dobbs decision was an anti-DEI decision. It was done because women were getting too much power and our prosperity was causing folks consternation. And then Students for Fair Admission created the space to come after education. So they've gone after all of those pieces. But what we have to remember are three things. One is that their intent is to use demonization to make us doubt our value system. I believe in DEI because I believe in diversity. I revere equity, and I am going to fight for inclusion. And anyone who's anti-DEI is telling you they are opposed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We should call them on it. Secondly, their strategy is to litigate and dismantle the federal protections that we have put in place since the Revolutionary War. So we're talking about 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 19th Amendment, but we're also talking about Title I, which allowed children to fully participate in education by finally putting money in place that allowed poor kids to have access. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a DEI law. We're talking about the Moral Land Act, which created the land grant colleges. We're also talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act, so unions are implicated. Anything that this country has done to level the playing field and invite more people to participate, that is DEI, and we cannot let them fracture us and lie to us about what it is, because their goal is to litigate and eliminate the federal protections and then legislate at the state level to make certain we can never amass enough power again to challenge their supremacy. And so if we want to push back, I encourage you to visit aprnetwork.org. We've got a bunch of information about DEI, things for you to do. But more importantly, we have a guide to tell you what your rights are. Because the other piece of what we need to understand is that the President of the United States cannot rescind by executive order constitutional amendments. He cannot rescind federal law, and he cannot tell us that we are not a part of this country. APR Network stands for American Pride Rises, because this is our country, these are our values, and we have the right to fight for them. And I'll pitch it over to Joyce.
So I don't have much to add, but I will say this. I think one of the mistakes that we made in this country was getting comfortable. not because we had succeeded, not because we had fixed all of the problems, but because we thought we had become capable of doing that based on the progress that we had made. We made the mistake of believing that progress was linear and that it was inevitable. And something that we learned after Barack Obama left office was that it was neither one of those things. And I think this is one of those areas. You know, it used to be that as a US attorney and as a lawyer doing civil rights work, most of the cases that I was doing involved what I would call, in legal terms, covert racism or discriminatory impact, but not discriminatory intent. I mean, that was sort of the zeitgeist, right? It was covert. Nobody was going out and doing it on purpose and out loud. And by God, here we are in 2025, and the racism is intentional. It is a feature. It is not a bug. They are proud of it. And when they talk about reversing DEI in this administration, what they're really talking about is imposing views that are racist, that are exclusionary, that make some Americans less than other Americans, that vilify immigrants. And look, y'all, we all know what this is. I mean, at our dinner table growing up, we told our kids you could never play the Hitler card because it never worked. Nothing was that bad. But what we are seeing happen is what they saw in Nazi Germany. It was this process of separating out some people and saying that they were less than or not as important as, or somehow dirty or ugly or diseased. So it was okay to do bad things to them. We're seeing that happen in weird ways right now, by the way. We're seeing federal employees, right, who thought that they would become the new class of victims. But now federal employees, they're bad guys, they're wasteful, they engage in fraud. It's okay to strip them of their jobs. It is not a hop, skip, and a jump from that to going back to intentional racism. And that is the moment I fear that we are in and that we need to all prepare for.
So, both of you have talked about the role of the courts. You've touched on the role of the courts in the fights that we have ahead of us. And so I want to orient our attention to the courts and some of the legal challenges that have already been filed. You know, we've seen a deluge of executive orders issued by the new administration, the funding freezes, firing federal employees, like you mentioned, Joyce, ending our participation in international agreements. The list goes on. And so many of these have already been challenged in court. I'd love to get your perspective on whether our courts are equipped to handle this. Do we have judges that you trust will uphold the rule of law? And what is the role of the everyday citizen in helping to ensure that the rule of law is upheld? I'll start with you, Joyce.
Well, thanks for coming to me with the easy softball question for the evening. Um,
Anytime.
Look, I'm going to start with this general caveat. I do not believe that we can afford to give up on the institutions because ultimately, you know, the rule of law, which fell into disfavor as we saw Donald Trump outrun it in criminal courts, the rule of law is what stands between us and tyranny, plain and simple. We need the courts. Will the courts be there for us? I think it's tough to say how this plays out. I do believe that the courts will hold on some fundamental issues. I think the middle ground is what I'm very, worried about, precisely where they'll land. And let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. We're seeing a lot of early successes in court right now. The lawyers are out in full force challenging DOJ, challenging Donald Trump's effort to rewrite the Constitution by striking out birthright citizenship, challenging Donald Trump when he violates Congress's power of the purse with impoundment cases that challenge his efforts to prevent congressionally mandated spending. And in most of these cases, we're seeing wins, but these are very early wins. These are just temporary restraining orders designed to freeze the status quo in place for a week or two while the litigation gears up. So I think it's too early to know how these cases will go. But we are seeing some subtle hints and we are seeing some flaws in Donald Trump's facade. And one of the big ones involves Elon Musk's status in government. Is he a government employee? Isn't he? Is he running DOJ? Isn't he? We've now got contradictory statements, including some made under oath in pleadings filed by the Justice Department. I do not believe that the judiciary will let the government off lightly for that. Whether that adds up down the road to 5 votes in favor of democracy on the Supreme Court, I'm not quite willing to hazard a guess about that yet. But I think having sort of created this monster, because it was the Supreme Court that said that presidents were immune from all consequences of criminality, which is what has permitted us to get to this point, my hope is that they will feel some need to restore the rule of law. Otherwise, the Roberts Court will end up being known as the court that destroyed the rule of law. I am hopeful that John Roberts does not want that to be his legacy, and he can bring one of his friends along with him.
I would add, it's important for us to also recognize that while we grew up with the litany of salvation that came from the courts, whether it was Brown v. Board of Education or Roe v. Wade, we do not live in a moment where we're going to see that kind of seismic societal change happen at the court level. But litigation isn't simply about winning. Sometimes it's about talking. And so we have to listen to, and I think, Joyce, it's so important that you laid out that there are early victories that are going to be met by later defeats. Hopefully, ultimately, when it gets to the Supreme Court, we will win out because the system will hold. But what we cannot do is vest our hope every time in the court. The court is a tool. We are also tools. Our job is to lever democracy into place and to remember that democracy exists at multiple levels. I am not underplaying at all the threat, the existential threat that we face, but I am pointing out that between there and nigh is a lot of space. And so part of our responsibility in this moment is to not be so overwhelmed by or fantasize about what can be that it exempts us from doing what must be done. We cannot pre-capitulate, but we also can't hope that everything's going to work. And so when you get called into action, whatever that action is, I want you to hold to this idea that we can't do everything everywhere all at once. It's a fantastic title for a movie. It is a terrible mission statement, but we can all do something somewhere soon. And in between those court cases, in between those terrible actions, our responsibility, our renewal of our commitment to action happens when we do something. But we've got to remove this mindset that if we go to court and we win, we've won. And if we go to court and we lose, we've lost. Neither is true. If we go to court, then we are telling the truth about what needs to be done. If we win, we've made an advance. If we lose, we simply have to find another way to tell the truth and demand what we deserve. But we cannot allow the notion of the court to become this mythical object of salvation. It is not. It may stave off destruction, and we will hope and we will fight and we will pray for it to be what it should be. But we have to remember that this is a nation of people, not of courts, not of a king, and not of legislators who are feckless and willing to abdicate their obligations, but of people who decide how much power our leaders hold.
Stacey, can I just add one thing to that? Because I think that's such an incredibly important fact. As Americans, we sometimes tend to look at just one moment in time without looking at the trajectory. This is true, I think, in elections, right? We lose one election, everybody throws their hands up in the air, and we disappear. Y'all, that's not how this works. It's this election and the next one and the one after that. It's building candidates. It's building support in communities. It's building power so that if we don't succeed this year, we can succeed down the road. And when I litigate, I think about it very much the same way, right? I may win this case or I may lose this case, but if I lose it, I want to lose it in a way that sets me up to win down the road. We saw Republicans do that successfully, conservatives, I should say, when they reversed abortion rights. We need to take a moment here and be smart and view this litigation for what it is, because Donald Trump is trying to take all of the power that exists in the executive branch of government, and maybe some of what belongs to Congress and the courts too, and enfold it in his greedy little hands in the Oval Office. And the strategy in litigation has to be to fight at every level, to do everything we can to get every court that considers one of these cases to talk about ways that there are limits on the executive's power. Otherwise, we end up with that unitary executive, the tyrant who controls everything. So we're going to lose some of these cases. but hopefully we're going to lose them in ways that help us with the ultimate mission.
Yeah, I think it's such an important perspective to think about litigation in the courts as a tool, like you both have just discussed. And I think as as an attorney, the three of us as attorneys, we oftentimes tend to think of it as the only tool, but it is just one of the tools that we all have in our toolbox. And I think it's really, really important for us to think about all of the other tools that we have at our disposal. One of the questions on the topic of the courts that we have gotten a lot in the chat, I've been looking at the chat, folks, so don't think that I'm ignoring you, but we've gotten a bunch of questions in the chat, and we had a lot of questions in the submissions before tonight about what happens if we win in court, but the administration refuses to comply with a court order. So could you speak to what happens in that scenario? What are the options available to us? And how do we deal with that type of situation?
I mean, you'll hear a lot about the constitutional crisis that occurs if the court rules and the president refuses to abide. That's why Congress matters so much. The decision not to enforce the laws of the land, and we learned this in Schoolhouse Rock, it's the court's responsibility to determine what the law actually means. But if Congress finds that the president, if the executive will not do their job, the mechanism is impeachment. You remove the people who will not do their jobs. And we have to be prepared to make certain that we have a Congress that will exercise that power. Now, the reality is, we know that the Senate, as it's currently structured, is unlikely to take that action. But that goes back to something Joyce said earlier. Folks are from everywhere. And part of our responsibility is to recognize that this isn't just one election. This isn't it took 250 years to get to here. We're 249. It's going to take a little bit of time to undo it all. It's going fast. I mean, this has been a 30-day sprint that feels like 117 years. But what we have to remember is that we do have a congressional capacity to demand action. They may refuse to do so, but we cannot permit that to happen. And part of our responsibility is to recognize that, yes, he may ignore the courts. And yes, Congress may abdicate their responsibility. That's when we're really in trouble. But even in that trouble, part of the work that we're doing, and this goes to something Joyce said earlier, it's the muscle that we're building. It's a muscle that we have to build. The muscle of democracy has atrophied because we've had it for so long. And I'm going to quote one other person that Joyce and I both know and adore, Heather Cox Richardson. Like, we got used to democracy being the thing we do good. And we aren't good at it anymore. It's like, yeah, we might have been able to win championships back when we were in high school, but we haven't run in a long time. And so we've got to remember that ultimately it comes back to us. And I'm going to keep saying that because we keep waiting for or imagining that there is some champion that is coming to save us. There is no cavalry. If there is, we be the cavalry. And anybody who likes old movies understands exactly what I just did there. Okay, Joyce, it's yours.
So I'm laughing, Stacey, because I'll out myself a little bit and say I'm the foolish person who agreed to write a book about how you save democracy during the first 6 months of the Trump administration. You know, most days I'm just like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm so dumb. But literally, that's the part that I'm working on right now, is this concept that we are the cavalry, because I deeply believe that in every age, and certainly in recent history, it has been the voters, right, who have saved this country. I mean, Donald Trump was not held accountable through impeachment. He was held accountable at the voting box, at the ballot box. That's ultimately where I think this heads. Donald Trump is a bully, and bullies are afraid of people who stand up to them. And I think that that's what we have to take as our North Star here. We have to stand up. We have to stand up early. We have to be loud. We have to be unafraid. As my friend Tim Snyder likes to say, do not obey in advance. Trump really, because of that bullying mechanism, gets a lot of people to cave early. We cannot afford to do that. You know, the vice president, J.D. Vance, who is no kin to me, by the way, was on social media saying, in essence, I'm not going to quote it correctly, but saying in essence, if we don't like court rulings, we don't have to follow them. J.D. Vance is a Yale-educated lawyer. He knows better than that. He understands that judicial review is one of the principles that this democracy is built upon. He is lying to Americans. Politely, we call it gaslighting sometimes. It's time to call it what it is. He is deliberately lying to the American people in order to do an end run around the power that belongs to the courts. And here I actually saw a sign of hope. He did it. Elon Musk did it. A couple of other Republicans jumped on that wagon. And then there were Republican senators who said enough. You know, their statements weren't bold enough for my taste. I'll be honest. I wish that they had condemned Donald Trump, condemned J.D. Vance, and stood for the rule of law. And that is not what today's Republican Party is. But Senator Thune, Senator Tillis, a couple of others said, no, we have to go to court. We don't disobey the court rulings. We follow court rulings. And the Trump administration then did the only positive thing that I've seen in whatever we're at right now, 4 weeks and counting. They filed appeals of decisions that they had lost in district court. Some of these TROs that were ordered against them, they appealed them instead of disobeying them. Now, look, there's plenty of evidence that their compliance has been pretty flimsy in some areas, but now there are courts looking at the evidence of that flimsy compliance and ordering them again to do very specific things to come into compliance. This is what we want to see. This is the process we need. We have to all stay on top of this one. If you are looking for an area that you can be involved in, this is it. And you know, normally I love to say that Twitter is not the real world, and it really isn't. But in some cases, our voices in social media count. And when there's this bombardment on social media in real life, when we are all persistently bothering even our red senators and red members, red representatives with this sort of insistence that we remain a rule of law country, Donald Trump, the bully, is chased into submission.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the role of social media here and of the information space in general. You know, both of you obviously have recognized the importance of the information space in your work. You both have podcasts. You're actively working to disseminate good information. How do you think about the threats that mis and disinformation pose to our democracy, and what are some of the methods that you've employed that others can employ as well to combat those threats in today's world? And we're approaching time, so let's try to keep the answers to about 2 minutes each. Thank you.
I think it's your turn.
Well, look, I think this is one of the most serious problems that we face. And I was discussing this with my students. I teach a class on democratic institutions. We were talking about this today. You know, there's this phenomenon that gets called low information voters, and I actually don't like that phrase. I think it's very patronizing and diminishing. And there are a lot of different things, failure of civics education, or, you know, other things that play into it. But there are people who don't have quality information, maybe because the vice president is telling them that the courts don't matter, or for whatever reason. And then there are people who are deliberately ignoring the truth. And when we're thinking about the disinformation, misinformation space, we're talking about people who are vulnerable for whatever reason to people who want to manipulate them and use false facts, or what I would call lies, to manipulate their political views. We saw it emerge. Folks in law enforcement were looking at this well before this, but in 2016, this becomes a real feature of the election when foreign outside interests are trying to drive a wedge between American voters to help Donald Trump get elected because they are afraid of a strong woman as president, one of the most qualified candidates either party has ever put up. They don't want Hillary, they want Trump. Disinformation becomes one of the wedges that drives voting in 2016. Knowing that, we have to find ways to combat the problem, but it's very difficult and very elusive. And look, I think the real answer is sort of a long-term effort called education. And education is tough right now. For one thing, Republicans have beaten Democrats to school boards, and many school boards are controlled by conservative people. That's a failure that we need to address. If you're looking for an office to run for, go and run for your local school board. But we can show up, we can talk, we can insist. In Finland, they have this great program where they teach fourth graders, oh my goodness, of all things, how to discern truth from false on the internet. It's a really fabulous, very common sense program that tells people to consider sources and viewpoints and when something was written, and to be smart consumers of knowledge. And to the extent that our school boards are not in a place right now where they would impose a common sense program like that for our kids, then we have to teach it at home, right? We can teach it in home, in family, in whatever space we have available to us, and not just kids. Sometimes we have to work with our parents as much as anyone else. My husband is from a classic Southern family. Boy, do they run the gamut, the full spectrum. Something that makes me feel hopeful is we have seen members of the family who went down the rabbit hole who have come back. And in all of those cases, what has brought them back is access to quality information, something that they can consider for themselves, because y'all, we are smart people. Americans are smart people. And if you can get accurate information in front of folks, they will ultimately figure it out for themselves. It might not be pretty, but they'll get there. The problem is getting the disinformation out of the mix. And that is a tough problem we need to all work on.
I would just add, if you go to my podcast website, Simply Required, I actually have this amazing conversation with Asosa Osa, who used to be with Fair Fight. She loves to start her own organization that focuses on disinformation. She's got amazing tips. Start with podcasts and then follow her to her website. But there are ways for us to push back. There are ways for us to understand. And one of the most important pieces is that it does not work. You can't yell someone out of their beliefs, but you can help lead them towards the truth. That's got to be our responsibility. We can lead them with humor. We can lead them with love. We can lead them with engagement, but you can't yell someone into believing you. And so check out the podcast, check out that episode while you're there, check out everything else. But it's a great episode that really helps, I think, to illuminate what Joyce is laying out, but gives you some really good tips on what to do next.
Yeah. Yeah, I've listened to that episode. Awesome episode. Sosa is amazing, and echoing everyone, please definitely watch that episode and check out Onyx Impact. So we've had an awesome conversation tonight. Thank you so much for all of these amazing insights. I want to close with a question that I'm hoping can help the folks in the audience persist as we go into this new administration in the next 4 years. For both of you, you've been doing this work for many years. How do you keep from being overwhelmed by what's going on right now? And do you have any words for the people on the call to help folks stay motivated and inspired as we continue this fight?
I'll start. I think it's important for us to remember that we didn't just arrive here. We've been coming to this place for quite some time, and we were just hoping that someone would stop the car before we got here. It didn't happen, and so our job is to figure out, what do we do now that we're here? I believe in understanding the scope of the problem, but then figuring out what's the piece that I can touch. I can't fix everything. And again, I go back to this: everything everywhere all at once does not work. But we can all do something somewhere soon. We can all find the place that matters to us, the thing that keeps you awake at night, or the thing that wakes you up in the morning, the thing that makes you excited. Because doing something out of fear or doing something out of hope is a better reason to keep doing it, because hope will defeat fear every single time. I will also add that I think we have to resist, we have to persist, and my favorite is we have to insist. I am a daughter of the South. They're not getting rid of me this easily. My grandfather, my mother's father, was born 25 years after the end of slavery. And in 2018, I became the first Black woman in American history to get the nomination. I didn't even have to get the job to make history. I just had to get the nomination. That span of history is a blink of an eye. And what we can do in these moments, what we can do when we commit ourselves to insisting on our prerogatives as Americans, our prerogatives as humans, our prerogatives as fellow people, we can insist that we will not allow immigrants to be deported without due process. We will not allow children to be told they are less than. We will not permit this. We will insist on being the best version of ourselves. And we will insist that our leaders do their jobs, and we will hold them accountable by showing them what those jobs are. That's why Fair Fight exists. That's why Joyce Vance exists. That's why I do the work that I do, because we are here to insist on the justice and the equity and the opportunities that we deserve. And as long as we insist, they cannot defeat us.
So here's how I'm going to get through the next 4 years. Amir, I need you to make a clip of what Stacey just said. And every morning when I get out of bed, I'm going to play that before my feet hit the ground and I get the first cup of coffee, because that's exactly, thank you, Stacey. That's the message that I need to hear. I am very hyper-focused right now on this notion, and I respectfully hear the people who say, this is just too much for me. I have to unplug from the news. I have to turn off. I can't pay attention. It's ruining my mental health. I hear that. But look, I'm really sorry. This is the moment that we are in, and we cannot afford to unplug. We cannot pretend that this moment will not touch us. We cannot pretend we don't have an obligation to help people around us who are being directly impacted already. You may not be able to run against Donald Trump and be the next president of the United States, but you can do something big or small in your own community. You know, I write a newsletter every night. I just try to explain the events that are happening at the intersection of law and politics to people who didn't have the incredible blessing that I had of serving at the Justice Department for 25 years. So I try to translate my experience to help people have perspective and more facts at their disposal. We can all find something that we can do, whether it's have these sorts of important conversations with people, whether it's, run for the school board, or whether it's just go and volunteer and read to kids at a local school. I promise you that there is something that you can do. And the one thing that will help you when you're having a really bad day and you wish that you could walk away from this work is you need to gather your friends around you, the people who are like-minded, the people who understand this moment and what's happening in the country. Because when you're feeling down, you don't need to be in a room where you have to justify your views about this horrible stage in our history. So find your friends, hold them close, hug them, kiss them, have dinner. You don't have to talk politics. You just have to be in community. We all need to be in community right now with people who feel as strongly as we do about the value of democracy.
Listen, y'all, if you are not feeling fired up after tonight, then you got to watch this episode again. And we will make the recording available. We are going to help everyone clip all of these little pieces of video so that they can watch them in the morning. Has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much to you both, Stacey and Joyce. Please, everyone, join me in thanking our very esteemed panelists here tonight. We really, really appreciate your time. And thank you to all of the 1,200 people who joined here tonight on an evening during the week. You took time out of your day to be here and to listen and to be engaged and involved in an incredibly important process, which is protecting our democracy and advancing our democracy. So thank you for being here. This is our first installment of Fair Fight Together. Please keep an eye out for information about the next series that we have as part of Fair Fight Together. And everyone, have a great evening. Thank you so much. We will be in touch.